get ourselves settled. Would you say this is a quorum here? We've done rather well, haven't we? Excellent. Great. What a great turnout. Well, how can we introduce this? I was passionate about this issue. I covered the referendum. I covered the aftermath of the referendum in Birmingham and the Black Country, actually, for Panorama. I've done a million interviews about it since. I've read loads, and I can honestly say, the deeper I go into it, the less I actually understand what is going on. There's a famous football referee said to me something once. We're at a World Cup. We were talking about the offside rule. Don't worry, I won't go on about this phrase. Talking about the offside rule, and he said, son, if you think you understand it, it's not that you understand it, it's just that you don't know enough about it. So it's in the spirit of that we're here. And I just think it's so important to generate some light rather than heat. It seems to me with this argument, and I interview people from both sides of it all the time. I moved the table a bit. It seems to me that so many people treat this like they might support a football club. Like you're either Brexit or Remainer, like you're a Villa fan or you're a Birmingham City fan. And you're never going to change your mind, no matter what the facts say. Well, football is one thing, that's fine. I think with this, it's sort of rather different. So I assume you've come here to shed some light rather than heat, really, on the situation, and that's great. And this is your man who's leading things. This is what your organisation is all about, Anand.
Firstly, thank you, Adrian, for doing this. Secondly, you're absolutely right. Whatever happens over the course of the next 2, 5, 10 years, Brexit, one way or another, will impact on everything. It will impact on the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the amount of money you get paid, what your country looks like. So it matters. It matters in a way that, in a sense, even elections probably don't, because elections you can change your mind afterwards in 5 years' time. We're an organisation called the UK in a Changing Europe, and we're an odd organisation because we're not out to campaign. We are not here to tell you Brexit is good, Brexit is bad, Brexit will work, Brexit won't work. We are funded to do things like this with people from the general public and just let you ask us what you want to ask about Brexit and try and answer as best we can. We're academics, we're not on either side of the debate. Part of our funding rules are we are totally impartial. So we worked in the referendum campaign with the Leave campaign and with the Remain campaign. And this is odd. This is absolutely the opposite of question time. You're not going to see us squabbling with it. Well, you'll see me and Catherine squabbling because we squabble because she's a lawyer and I do politics and we squabble. But we won't squabble about Brexit. We're just here to try honestly and as well as we can, based on what we know, to answer any questions you have about what Brexit means, how it's going to work, what's going to happen next, what it might mean for prices, what it might mean for politics. The aim of this evening is that you ask your questions and we will try to the best of our ability to answer them. So I'll let my colleagues introduce ourselves and we can kick off.
Go on.
You want to go first?
Okay, so my name's Catherine Barnard. I'm a Professor of Law at the University of Cambridge, and so I can answer some of your questions that you might have about the EU, about the institutions, about the Court of Justice, about immigration, those sorts of things.
And I'm Tom Sampson. I'm a lecturer at the London School of Economics. I'm a trade economist, which meant that until 2 years ago, very few people were interested in the work I did, and now that's changed quite dramatically. So I can talk about sort of the trade economics of Brexit and other questions related to kind of what Brexit's going to mean for the economy.
So it's up to you to ask questions. I can't emphasise enough. The more basic the question, the better. Please don't, my school teacher's been in Hagley sometime in the last century used to say, if you don't know the answer, then sure somebody else won't either, so just ask the question. So I hate to sound like that, but honestly, we can't get too basic here. And I'll ask staff questions if you won't. I promise you they're my speciality. So does anyone want to get us started? Yes, sir. Okay, good. So go on. So you bring human beings before money. Extraordinary thought. Okay, did everyone sort of get the drift of the question? When are we going to stop talking about trade in the negotiations and talk about the human rights of where people live and where they can work? That's only because you didn't have your microphone. So, okay.
Yeah, I think you raise a really good point. I just want to give you a small bit of background. The way the negotiations are working is that they've been divided into 3 phases. The first phase, which is the phase we're in at the moment, is about the divorce, and it's about 3 big-ticket items, which are the Northern Ireland border, the Brexit bill, and citizens' rights. So that's the rights of EU migrants who are already in the UK and UK nationals who are already in the EU. And only once issues have made sufficient progress there will they move on to talk about transition and the future trade deal. Now, already in this phase that we're in at the moment, citizens' rights are on the table, and Theresa May this morning wrote to every single EU national who's here, for whom they've got an email address, to say, you will be fine. Unfortunately, that's not quite true, because they'll be fine if they've done 5 years, but they've still got to go through a process of applying to get what's called settled status. For those who've done less time, the position's less clear. So those are about EU citizens. What about workers' rights? Well, the good news is about workers' rights, we get loads and loads of workers' rights coming from the EU, and it was thought that as a result of the Leave vote, a lot of those workers' rights would be repealed. However, Theresa May has committed herself, not just once, but several times, to say that so long as she's Prime Minister, she will preserve those workers' rights. Now, when she first committed to that last October at the party conference, it looked like she was going to be Prime Minister till about 2050, so therefore really secure protection. Of course, we know that politics is very fluid now. But workers' rights at the moment will be preserved. Consumer rights also preserved for a period of time. Human rights, a bit more tricky, because the human rights, there are 2 sources, one coming from the European Convention, which has got nothing to do with Brexit, and the other lot coming from the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And so far the UK government has said we're not going to respect the Charter post-Brexit. So a lot of people are very worried about what's going to happen to human rights.
Is there any supplementary you've got there? Is there anything specific on your mind?
I was thinking of all the things that you covered there, so I think you've given as much of an answer as we can at the moment without using a crystal ball.
So when will we get to it then, in negotiations? When will? Yeah.
Well, the trouble is, it's always been an ancillary part, so it's always been on the side. With trade has always been the big issue. The future trade deal is what's called phase 3. So we're in phase 1 at the moment. And Theresa May had hoped that at the European Council, which is taking place today and tomorrow, that we would move from phase 1 to phase 2. And phase 2 is the transitional arrangements, and then phase 3 is the future trade deal. The trouble is, sufficient progress hasn't been made at phase 1. Sufficient progress hasn't been made, particularly about the money. And therefore we're stuck at phase 1. And that's why there's all this talk about trade, because the UK is desperate to get onto the trade deal, but the EU won't, because they say the trade deal is stage 3, we're currently stuck at phase 1. And this is where the politics and the law begin to interact. But even with a future trade deal, there's not going to be a whole lot about human rights in that.
Thank you very much.
Hi, could I ask about one of the issues where actually all of the parties seem to agree, but they don't seem able to agree about how it can be put into practice, and that's Northern Ireland. Everybody agrees that the border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland should be a frictionless border, but everybody agrees it should control trade and immigration. Has anybody got any idea how you can have a frictionless border that controls trade and immigration?
Well, the simple answer to that is absolutely not. No way at all. And we're in a weird place now, because on the one hand the government is saying we're going to clamp down on immigrants from all around the world, and including possibly from the European Union. We're going to tighten our borders because we have a target of tens of thousands of immigrants, which they've reiterated over and over again. On the other hand, they're saying we won't have a border between the north and south of Ireland, which presumably means that anyone, I mean, take one issue. The Irish are far more liberal when it comes to allowing Iraqis in than we are, okay? And once they're in, they can get travel documents within about a couple of months in the Republic of Ireland. If if you don't have a border, you can't possibly do lower immigration and controlling your border while having no friction. There's no way of doing it. But I mean, the Irish border is fundamental. Now, part of this, I mean, Catherine talks about phases. The British government is right when it says to the European Union, you're talking nonsense. We can't solve the Irish border now because we need to know what our trading relationship is. And this is all about something called the customs union. Customs union allows us to trade things across frontiers without having checks at the borders, all right? The British government has got a really weird position on this because they say we want to be out of the customs union, but we don't want a border. Now think about this from the EU's point of view. Let me give you a really silly example, all right? Bras. About 10 years ago, bras.
As in,
Well, your
bras,
mother's here.
yeah,
She can explain it to you afterwards if you want. But
this is the kind of economics I can understand this.
so about 10 years ago, the Italians in particular started to get really huffy about the fact that the Chinese were making loads of bras very cheaply and dumping them in the European market, okay? So the Italians went to the European Commission and they said, look, this is unfair competition, and the Europeans stuck a massive tariff on bras, okay, from China. Now, one of the things our government has said is when we're out of the European Union, we're going to sign trade deals. So imagine Liam Fox goes to China, says we're going to sign a trade deal, and Chinese say that's absolutely fine, you've got to cut the tariff on bras. Which is fine, because actually all our retailers like Marks and Spencer's hate the tariff on bras because it means they have to charge more for the bras, okay? That happens. Now, we are paying less for our Chinese bras than the Italians are, and there is no border in Northern Ireland, and we're outside the customs union with this trade deal. What is to stop me from buying 10,000 bras, hiring a truck, driving through Ireland, going from Ireland to the continent, driving to Italy, and flogging my bras 20% cheaper than the Italians can? Nothing at all.
It's a brilliant idea.
Well, I thought this through in some detail, actually. I have a business plan.
Yeah.
The point is, they're trying to square a circle and they're failing at the moment, and we need far, far more detail. The only thing the British government has said that is substantive is we'll use technology to do it. We'll have technology at the border, we'll scan people and stuff like that. I don't know if you, like me, have had the experience of those car parks where you pay in advance, you turn up, and there's a camera when you go out that films your number plate and the barrier goes up and you go out, yeah? If your number plate's dirty, if you're driving the wrong sort of car and your number plate's in the wrong place, it doesn't work. Imagine that with tens of thousands of trucks and the system breaks down. There is no answer as yet. The government has not figured this out, and I don't think they will. I don't know what my colleagues think, but I don't think there is a way of figuring it out.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly no easy solution to this problem, unfortunately. I mean, one idea people suggest is instead of having the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, you could put the border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Now, that's feasible in that we know how to implement that, but obviously it creates a problem in that typically we don't have customs borders within countries, so there are objections to it on that front. But in terms of how you would kind of essentially police that Northern Ireland border, if we were to leave the customs union, no one has a solution to that, unfortunately, at the moment.
Where would the DUP be on putting a border between here and Northern Ireland?
Fizzing mad.
Yeah. Extraordinary business. Anyone else? You change your mind? Yes, we had a... Hang on a sec, we'll get the microphone to you.
I wanted to follow up from the previous question because I think it was, if I understood it correctly, also about trades with certain nations, third countries. Many trade agreements include human rights, social clauses to avoid the worst forms of exploitation and social dumping. The EU's agreements include those, although they're not very good at it. So the UK has the potential to do better than the EU, but also the potential to do much worse than the EU. And I fear that government being very desperate for deals with anybody, and Liam Fox going to Malaysia and all sorts of countries, and Philippines, I fear they will just not include any human rights clause. But I wonder what the opinions are.
So I think I would say to that the EU's already said that if we're going to go for a deep and special relationship, which is what the Prime Minister has said, it will be conditional on us accepting EU social and environmental standards. But what's not clear is whether it's the full panoply of social rights that there are at the moment or some watered down version. And this is where the politics also comes into play. Liam Fox has gone on record, Liam Fox being the Principal, the Secretary of State for the Department of International Trade, and he's gone on record as saying that he thinks we need to cut labour standards to try and boost jobs. And so this is the man who will be negotiating from the UK side the future trade deal. And so then the question is whether how keen we are to get that future trade deal and whether we will agree to sign up to what the EU want from us. There's a further issue which I think is underlying your very pertinent question, which is about enforcement. It's all very well to have a whole bunch of, isn't it nice that we all, look after children and small animals, but actually if children, small animals and workers can't actually get to the courts to enforce their rights, then that becomes a real problem. Now, this is where the interplay between what goes on at EU level and national level becomes important, because you might have heard of the EU withdrawal bill. That's the bill that's going to take us out of the European Union at domestic level. And the European Union withdrawal bill says we're going to, basically the aim behind the bill is to take that whole body of EU legislation and dump it into domestic law. So for a period of time, all of that EU social consumer legislation will be part of UK law, but then there's nothing to stop Parliament going forward from repealing that as and when it chooses to, unless there is some trade deal that stops it.
Were you talking in part about EU treaties with third countries, so EU trade? Can I just say a couple of things about that? I mean, you're right, the EU quite often, when it signs a trade deal, insists that you have to sign these human rights riders. And in some places, that's great. In some places, it's a total pain. So if you take the country that my family come from, India, the Indians look at the European Union who put these riders on and say, hang on, you colonised us. You, wrecked our economy. And now you're asking us to give you guarantees to be nice to people, get lost. So actually, sometimes this becomes a real political issue. So it sometimes means that the EU doesn't sign the trade treaties it wants to. Now, the EU is far from brilliant in a number of respects. And one of the things, for instance, we could do when we left is be a lot nicer to farmers in the third world than the EU is. And the EU has a proud track record of basically screwing farmers in poor countries so we can protect European agriculture. It's not inconceivable that our government signs trade deals that encourages farming in Africa and says we'll take your goods, we'll pay slightly less than we did for the Italian protected stuff, and that will be fine. But the simple answer is we don't know. We have no idea what our government intends to do. And until they say what they intend to do, we're going to be none the wiser.
I kind of wanted to add one more thing to that, which is from an economic perspective, trade agreements matter when you sign them with countries that you do a lot of trade with. So about half our trade is with the EU, fine, let's put that to one side. Our next biggest trade partner by far is the US. So the big prize that's out there for the UK in terms of future trade agreements is doing a deal with the US. And if you're going to be negotiating with the US, you're going to be negotiating about kind of what kind of regulatory system you have. And obviously we'll be starting from a point where typically US regulatory standards are much more lax than UK standards. So
The chicken thing.
the chicken is a good example. The chlorinated chicken. Will you allow chlorinated chicken to be sold in the UK? And if you want to get a trade deal with the US, you're going to have to give ground on some of those issues. So I think that would be a concern of how we approach those kind of negotiations.
So what's the balance with the US? Do we send more to them than they send here?
It depends if you look at our statistics or their statistics. Gave a talk recently where I stood up and said, well, if you look at the UK trade data, we have a surplus with the US, and then someone from the US stood up and said, well, it's the opposite way around according to our statistics. So, what that essentially tells you is that the trade is roughly balanced, and there's some errors in the data that make it hard to say.
But it's worth a lot, so that's got to be got right somehow.
Yeah. It's kind of a deal with China or India or anyone else other than the US is much smaller beer.
But I only asked because I can't remember the last time I bought anything that said made in the USA on it. I know that's naive. The only thing I'll bring is the tubes on, the pipes at petrol stations. For some reason it says made in USA on them. That's the only thing I've seen. But so what is it they're sending here?
So one area where we will trade with them is a lot is in kind of services. So not actual kind of tangible goods, but things like financial services, and obviously an area where there's a lot of trade back and forth between London and New York. But also, if you think about when you go to the movies, you're probably watching a movie that was made in the US. So that, there's that kind of trade as well.
You had a question.
Sorry, thank you. if I can just kind of step back to the previous question about the Irish border, you kind of instinctively reach for trade and immigration as a way of looking at the border, but you know this is a place of history and conflict.
They've had a few issues over the years.
So even in the best case scenario, even if, you know, as far as I understand it, the government's basically at the moment going, well, something will come up, we'll work it out some way. Even in the best case scenario, what are the prospects for the Good Friday Agreement? What are the prospects for the region and for the maintenance of peace in Ireland?
Well, I can talk about politics, you can talk about the law if you want. I will say something about the economics, because I don't think we should understate it, because, for instance, 80% of the Republic's agricultural exports come to us. And the question then is, if there are customs checks, those cabbages are going to go off at the customs post. So it's a massive deal economically for the Republic.
I heard Owen Paterson this morning saying it's no problem, that's old thinking. The cabbages won't rot, they'll just be zapped by some kind of reader and be swept through.
We'll do a separate section on Owen Paterson in a minute. So, for those who don't know, the Irish settlement at the moment, the political settlement at the moment, rests on this balance. The Unionists want to be part of the UK, and they are part of the UK because they're in Northern Ireland. They're happy with that. They can live with an open border. They can live with free movement between North and South. They're UK citizens. They enjoy that. That satisfies them. The nationalists in the North, not wild about being part of the United Kingdom, but the payoff for them, if there's an open border, they can come and go. The island of Ireland essentially has an integrated economy, so you can feel like you're part of a united Ireland. I was talking to someone in Dublin a couple of weeks ago, and they said, we cannot believe the fact that all of a sudden, all the debates in this country are about Irish unification. Because all of a sudden it's become a live issue, because what the nationalists in the North are saying is, stick a border there, and the settlement no longer is acceptable to us. Because all of a sudden we're dealing with two different countries. And so, you know, many things might happen. I'm not saying there will automatically be a return to violence, though God knows the political situation in Northern Ireland, they haven't got a government, as you know, and they're failing to get a government. So it's a very fragile political settlement at the moment. You know, I wouldn't be surprised if, you know, as the cameras and stuff go up at the border, people go knock on there. Very, very quickly. Because there's a very, very strong feeling against it. But the feeling in Ireland was always, at a certain point in time, the demographics will mean that the Catholics in the North will start agitating for a referendum 20 years down the line. I think history moved on 20 years very, very quickly now. And it is too soon to say. I mean, you'll hear this a lot from us this evening. We don't know yet. We don't know yet what will happen. But it has certainly made an already unstable political situation far more unstable.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I feel personally invested in this because I grew up in just outside Belfast, and I grew up at the height of the Troubles, and it was, looking back, a really very dangerous time. And I was back in Belfast a couple of weeks ago, and in the centre of Belfast, and what struck me, and it strikes me each time I go back, is actually how the religious political issues are not even below the surface, they're on the surface. The murals are still on the walls, and the murals are still fresh paint. It's not peeling paint, you know, that because the Good Friday Agreement has brushed all of this away. And so there was a real sense of just how precarious the situation is in the North. And the genius of the Good Friday Agreement was that it actually was operating not in the framework of UK law, but in the framework of EU law. And so it was the EU rules that applied that said there's got to be free movement of goods and persons across this border, giving an open border. And the moment that you have any type of control on that border, any type of boots on the ground, they promptly become a target. And you've got to remember this border is actually very long indeed. I think there's about 300 crossing points. So it's going to be very difficult to police all of those crossing points. So there'll be, in reality, 15 or 20 major crossing points, which actually makes life very difficult for the people who live on the border because they've got used to doing their shopping or buying their petrol on one side or other of the border. There's quite a lot of cross-border healthcare provisions. So you might go to the south to get your hip replaced. And all of these arrangements have operated in the context of EU law, and all of this gets knocked away if there is no satisfactory solution.
Let's get a question from this side.
Hello. On your Twitter feed at the top, you've got quite a nice hard-hitting video about how disastrous a no deal would be. And you've also got 4 points that have to be for a successful Brexit that you'd be looking at around, is it economy, fairness, I can't remember the other 2 on here, but anyway, I'm just wondering, bearing in mind how different press are reporting different things and nothing seems to be going quite well with the negotiations, what you think, how close we are. Are we anywhere close to either having a no deal or a successful Brexit? What do you think?
Can I just start by saying we didn't pay her to ask this question. You should all go to our website because it's fantastic and there is a superb video there.
Is it fronted by? I can't remember.
No idea. No deal. There's a lot of talk about no deal. And let me just be clear about what I mean by no deal. No deal means that we don't just not get a trade deal, we don't finish what Catherine called phase 1. So we leave the European Union with nothing, with no agreement on the terms of us leaving, no agreement on the future. It will be bad. Do not listen to people who say it won't be bad. It will be bad at a very basic level because the EU treaties resolve these issues such as under whose courts should you enforce contracts between people who sell from here or buy from here from other European countries. So the basics of economic exchange will be uncertain if we fall out without a deal. And there are loads of other things. Will we be able to sell medicines or test medicines because actually the regulator for medicines is a European regulator. The day after we leave, we don't know. Will flights be able to take off? We don't know. Ryanair, if we don't have a deal, won't be able to fly from the UK to Spain because they're not a UK registered airline. International rules say you can fly from your home country to other countries. You can't fly in between 2 foreign countries. So it will be messy in the extreme if we leave. Now, are we close to no deal? Actually, I don't think we are. I think, and I'm a lone voice saying this, so if my colleagues want to disagree, I'm sure they will. I think the negotiations are going all right up to now. I think the press have been unduly negative. I think if you look beyond the headlines that you see, the negotiators have had a list of hundreds of technical issues they've had to address, and they've ticked off an enormous number. Okay? EU negotiations always go the same way. Nothing happens. Everyone panics. At the 11th hour, everyone goes, oh my God, we need to focus on this now. Now, I'm not saying they're going to say to us, in the next 2 days, you've made sufficient progress. I am very confident that by Christmas, they will. So I think the negotiation will keep going. I think ultimately, the government knows that they're too scared to say out loud too often that no deal would be terrible for us. If they were really planning for no deal, Dover would be a building site. Why? Because at the moment, I think there are about 10 or 15 parking spaces for lorries. You'd need 2,500 because everything would be checked. Okay? If the government was serious, you would see the cranes now, and you don't. So I suspect that there's a lot of political bluster, as you know, that's what politicians do, they bluster, yeah, we'll be fine with no deal. Ultimately, the government's working very hard to prevent it. The European Union doesn't want no deal either because it will disrupt their trade. If I were to guess, and God knows predicting politics is a stupid business at the moment, but if I were to guess, I'd say we will get some sort of deal on Article 50. We might not get a great trade deal in 5 years' time, but for the moment, I don't think we should be panicking about this because the negotiators actually are making more progress than most of us think.
When it's said, we'll just fall back on WTO rules, everyone says that as though they know what WTO rules are. So perhaps you might care to explain. Is there a nice little, can you buy them in foils or something?
The WTO, right, what is it? It's the World Trade Organization, which is an organization that we set up under a different name originally after the Second World War as a club for countries to come together and negotiate tariff reductions. So progressively over the last 60 years, the WTO has negotiated agreements between its members about what tariffs, so what taxes on imports you charge on other countries who are in the club. Right? And initially it was a club of about 20 rich countries, now it's a club with almost every country in the world in it. Right? So what that means is if we were to trade with the rest of the world on WTO terms, which is what would happen if we left the EU without any kind of new deal with the EU, the tariffs we would charge and the terms under which we trade with other EU countries would be exactly the same as those which we currently trade with, say, like the US or China or Japan or any other country we trade with. So it would kind of, so at the moment we have special trading relations with the EU because we're part of the EU. But if we were to leave, we would just start trading with the EU on the same terms as we tariffs would go up a little bit, but more importantly, what economists like to refer to as non-tariff barriers would go up. So what are non-tariff barriers? Well, it's things like, do you have the right, if you produce a good in the UK, to sell that good in another country? So as a member of the EU, if I produce a good legally in the UK, I can sell it to any other European country without having to kind of jump through any other loopholes. But if I want to sell a good in the US, I need to prove that it meets whatever the appropriate standards and regulations are in the US. And that's actually probably a much bigger cost for businesses than tariff barriers. So that's one of the real concerns with the kind of WTO scenario would be suddenly you wouldn't necessarily know that you could produce a good in the UK and sell it anywhere else in the EU.
So the WTO rules are about the level of the tariff. Yeah. They're not about whether you can actually sell it somewhere.
No, they're not about the rules at all.
Yeah.
So there's nothing in. Well, is there not another set of WTO rules somebody should be getting busy writing? So.
Well, can I just say something about Ireland in the context of this? Tom's right that actually tariffs are relatively low for most things, though you've got to wonder whether BMW or foreign car firms are going to be happy about getting tariffs charged on exports to Europe from here, which they'll get. They're about 10% of the car. If you think back to Ireland, okay, there are farms in Ireland where the cows are in the north, pasteurisation's in the south, and bottling's in the north here. WTO tariffs on dairy products are about 45 to 48%. Now you think about those farms, they would go out of business. I mean, even if they didn't charge the tariff every single time you got across the border, if they said just the finished product, for agricultural products, and that matters a lot in Ireland, it will be putting farms out of business because their prices will skyrocket.
And I should just say on WTO, we spend a lot of time talking about goods because we think, because goods is something we can very easily get our heads around. In reality, goods forms about 15% of our economy. What's really of interest to us is services, and services about 70-80% of our economy. And the WTO does very little in respect to freedom of services, particularly financial services, which is so important to our economy. So don't be taken in by these bland statements. It will be fine, we can do everything under the WTO, because key aspects of our economy will not be helped by the WTO. Furthermore, the lawyer's point is that while you've got a set of rules, set of tariffs that can be charged, and there are some rules about these so-called non-tariff barriers that you've heard about, the problem for me as a small business to get those rules enforced is really, really hard. And so I'd have to lobby the UK government to get the UK government to act on my behalf. Whereas at the moment, under EU law, if the French are mucking me about and causing me trouble, I can go straight to the French courts, or I can complain to the Commission, and the Commission can do something about it. The WTO is not a substitute for a proper deal under the EU.
The lady behind us.
Thanks. Whether we drop out completely or whether we come to some arrangements, I think everybody's clear that we will need some new trade deals. My very simple question is, how long does it take to have one?
The short answer is how long's a piece of string. The reality is that with a standard trade deal between the EU and Canada, now to be fair, that is probably one of the more sophisticated trade deals that the EU's ever entered into. It's called the Canadian CETA in the jargon. That took about 7 to 9 years, and it's now going through the ratification process, which requires the ratification of 27 national parliaments, and in those countries like Belgium, which have got regional parliaments, all 7 regional parliaments have got to have their say. So actually the process of actually negotiating and then concluding a trade deal with the EU could be really very time consuming. Now there is a difference, of course, at the moment our rules are basically in conformity with EU laws, so it's not the big shift that there is with the Canadian situation. However, never before has the EU negotiated a trade deal about lowering the bonds between a country rather than increasing the bonds between a country. And so the answer is we don't know how long that future trade deal will take to negotiate. And once it's negotiated, if it's deep, then it's likely to have to be ratified by all of these national and regional parliaments. It only takes Wallonia, which is one of the very small parliaments in Belgium, to block any future trade deal. Now that's the one with the EU. With the other, if we're trying to negotiate a trade deal with the US or with India, which, as we've already heard, the US is the big prize. What's interesting about trade deals, that there are three big blocks. There's US, there's China, and there's the EU. And they all have big teams of negotiators, and they are fantastic negotiating. And what they do is that they negotiate with smaller countries. And basically, they dictate, they're the big fish, they dictate the terms to the smaller countries. And we will be in the position of being a smaller country. What's interesting is that those three big beasts, the three big players, haven't got trade deals with each other because their model of going in and dictating terms won't apply when you've got the other two big beasts. And so in reality, we will be the recipients of whatever the US or China, if they so wish to enter a trade deal, we will be recipients of what they want rather than us having much firepower in trying to negotiate our terms.
You must know something about trade deals as well. Anything you want to
I mean, I have very little to add to what Catherine just said, but I mean, another way of thinking about it is the more ambitious a trade deal you want, the longer it is going to take, right? In principle, a trade deal could be very quick if you just went to the US and said, we will accept all your terms, where's the dotted line, we sign up, right? But if you want, a deep and special partnership with the EU, or you want a trade deal with the US where we're not simply signing up to the US terms and we actually have a proper negotiation, that's going to take much longer. So quick trade deals are available, and even quick here means a few years, right, rather than decades. But if you want a trade deal that will actually be good for Britain, it's inevitably going to take a lot of time. We shouldn't expect to see any progress on that in the near future.
And of course, countries like New Zealand and Australia are reluctant to start even talking about trade deals until they know what sort of trade deal the UK's got with the EU. So that will also be.
Noting that you're independent in the Brexit debate, nothing that you said to us over the last sort of 40 minutes suggests that this is a seemingly brilliant idea. So I just wondered if you could tell us what you politically, economically, legally think are the advantages that we can crystallise from Brexit. And I would ask if you could say, what do you think the percentage chance is that we will actually achieve the suggested benefits? I understand there are theoretical benefits. How practically likely are they?
Great question.
Right. Well, the first thing is there are people for whom the notion of sovereignty is more important than money, or the notion of control is more important than simply economic size. And to give him his due, Nigel Farage said during the referendum campaign, when asked, look, Nigel, everyone says that if you cut immigration, you're going to make the British economy smaller. He said, some things are more important than money. Now, if that's your view, then there's an obvious benefit in leaving the European Union, because you leave an organisation, the only organisation in the world whose law trumps national law, where you can have a law which you voted against, which is voted for by majority in the European Union, and yet even if you lose that vote, that law becomes law in your country. For some people, that's just unbearable. That's just an infringement on the right of the state, and we shouldn't have it. Now, if you don't think that politics totally trumps economics, and you think actually there are ways in which we should be able to do this whilst preserving the economic relationship, there are all sorts of ways of leaving the European Union. One of the interesting things about Theresa May is that out of go back to the referendum, okay? The referendum gave you two boxes. One was leave, one was remain. The problem is that leave could have been subdivided into 5, okay? Is that you could leave and be Canada, you could leave and do WTO, you could leave and be Norway, you could leave and be something completely different. There are all sorts of ways of leaving, okay? Norway is in the single market, so my colleagues have talked about trade. They get to enjoy that rule sharing that they have in the European Union, but without being part of the club. You have to pay for that, literally. The Norwegians pay a check, and also they have to accept EU rules, but they don't get a say over them. So there are trade-offs involved. Okay? But actually, the Norwegian model would imply significantly less economic damage for our country than a position that the government has at the moment, which is we'll leave the single market and we'll leave the protection. So there are gradations of this, and there are trade-offs involved. It might well be. I mean, I think Liam Fox sometimes says sensible things. I think he's wrong, absolutely wrong, where he says geography no longer matters, we'll trade with New Zealand instead of Europe, because actually, if you think about it, we make cars with Europe, okay? BMW will send car components between Germany and Oxford, and they'll make those components, and it's quick, and they're doing it to deadlines of about half an hour or an hour to get those cars out. We can't do that. Don't tell me you can stick it on a ship and do it as efficiently, because you just can't, all right? But it might be that we can sign trade deals and get greater efficiencies in some of those deals, and sign deals that are more tailored towards our economy. Because, you know, negotiating with the EU means you've got to listen to the French. So the French are very, very good at sticking their priorities. So, you know, the first thing the EU does when it negotiates a trade deal is make sure that yogurt gets protected status, because otherwise the French never freeze. So we're free of that. We can negotiate trade deals that are more suited to our economy. Okay? Ultimately, I think that any solution short of membership will cost us. Because actually, reducing trade with your biggest and closest trading partner is not going to help you anymore. But I can see why, that in terms of a trade-off, if you do that in a way that limits the economic damage, you might think, okay, that's absolutely worthwhile, because we've restored our political confidence. It means that Parliament can't hide behind the EU. One of the things that annoyed me about EU membership is a number of politicians. It's only got 2 bars, now, the buck stops in Westminster once we stop. Politicians have to take responsibility. And I think that's actually quite a healthy thing for our politics, because it means that don't talk about Brussels. This is about you need to listen. I think that's good. Final thing I'd say, because I come from the north and I hate the state of this country and its economy, is there are other ways of doing this short of the EU. But leaving the European Union has completely altered the political programs in this country. People talk about intergenerational effects. People talk about inequality. People talk about the gap between North and South now in a way that we never did before that vote. Because a number of people who felt...
We want to hear you twice.
You didn't hear a word I said then, did you? I mean, like, you're all being very polite. So I think, you know, that's one thing that's positive that's come out of the referendum for me, is that actually we're talking about different things in our politics than we were beforehand, and maybe we'd never have talked about those without this kind of shock. Ultimately, it's going to take 10 years for us to know.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah,
Tom.
I mean,
I think you're all right. I think you're all right.
I mean, from an economic perspective, I mean, I don't see there as being a lot of potential upsides, but you can ask kind of, you know, are there EU programs we're involved in, which we had to take part in, because everyone in the EU does, but which aren't really tailored for the UK economy? And one obvious one to kind of highlight would be the Common Agricultural Policy, which is essentially a way of subsidizing farmers, and it exists politically in the EU as a way of subsidizing French farmers. It's the French again, as Anand mentioned. Leaving the EU will mean we can leave the Common Agricultural Policy, and it will give us an opportunity to develop a farm policy that is more suited to Britain's needs. Now, in practice, what that's likely to mean is that there will, over time, be lower subsidies for farmers, and the price of food will be lower in the UK, and overall the UK economy will probably benefit from that, but not everyone will benefit, and probably it will be the farmers themselves who are the losers. So even there, you know, there's potential gains to the UK economy, but there's going to be a very vocal minority who potentially stand to lose quite a lot from those changes.
On the law front, the flippant answer is that all uncertainty is good news for lawyers, because people run to lawyers to get legal advice. So I foresee a boom. Yeah. I foresee a boom in law firms, but less flippantly, the area I've been doing quite a lot of work is in respect of immigration, and we know that it's one of the most sensitive issues surrounding the Brexit debate. And I think one of perhaps the beneficial consequences of leaving is that it will force councils to be much more alert to some of the inequalities and identity issues that have arisen as a result of large-scale, particularly Eastern European migration. And what I mean by that is that if you take a town like Spalding or Boston in East Anglia, they've had a significant percentage increase in the number of EU migrants. And there's some shocking practices have been going on, not of course universal, but hotbedding, as it's called. So wealthy business people have been buying up houses in these towns and then renting them out. And you rent out an 8-hour slot, and you sleep in the bed for 8 hours, and then you work for 8 hours, and then you have 8 hours, and you're basically hanging around the street because you're not allowed to come back to the house because a third shift is already in that bed. And so the perception is for the locals that there are a lot of, they feel that there's lots of Eastern Europeans, and they are hanging around, they're speaking a language that the locals don't understand, and they feel it's impacted upon their identity. And so there are issues about identity, but also allocation of public services, much greater attention now with this migration fund to put some money into those areas which feel that they've been most affected by migration.
Okay. Lady there, please, and then the gentleman.
You touched on this a little bit in this question, but I wanted to raise the issue of democracy and to come back to the point that was made earlier about how Theresa May has kind of promised that employment rights and consumer rights will be guaranteed through the EU withdrawal bill by incorporating all of these EU rules into UK legislation. But it seems that the withdrawal bill will allow future governments to amend those rules using secondary legislation, so outside of kind of full parliamentary oversight. So considering the kind of grand promises of the Leave campaign that we would restore parliamentary sovereignty, what do you think are the implications of Brexit for British democracy?
We deal with the legal technical point. So on the technical point, you're absolutely right. All of the whole point about the withdrawal bill is to essentially take the whole corpus, the whole body of EU law, drop it into UK law, and then I think you're referring to clause 6 of the bill and the so-called deficiencies clause, which is the use of so-called Henry VIII powers. So that's powers given to the executive, so this essentially the civil service, to amend other acts of parliament or other statutory instruments if there's a deficiency in our law in some way. And a lot of people are very worried about the implications for democracy of having such broad Henry VIII clauses in the withdrawal bill. But you're absolutely right, whether we do it by Henry VIII clauses or whether we just do it by a separate Act of Parliament, repealing the Act of Parliament that contains a lot of these employment rights. The reality is that that's one of the things that people voted for, and this is where democracy is in action. The majority party in Parliament will decide whether to do that or not, and they will be held to account. So there is a bit of a paradox going on, that there's talk about take back control to British Parliament, but in fact, because of the sheer enormity of delivering Brexit, it will be actually taking back control really to the executive, who've got to work phenomenally hard over the next 18 months to produce 1,000 or so statutory instruments to try and deliver Brexit in a timely manner so that we can leave on the 29th of March 2019.
Can I just add a couple of things? I mean, firstly, it is a paradox, but it's a short-term paradox. Once it's done, the point I made earlier holds, which is ultimately then it's up to Parliament to run the country, and they can't blame other people for it. Now, the other thing about democracy is...
Could change their minds.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the principle of our sovereignty, isn't it? One Parliament can't bind the next. No Parliament can say, we'll never do this, because in 5 years' time you've got a new Parliament. But the second thing is, I mean, if you think back to the referendum, what did people complain about when it came to our politics before the referendum? It was apathy, disengagement, disinterest. And you think back to those months before June 2016, and as Catherine said, we travelled the length and breadth of the country. I think we did about 50 events like this around the country. And what was, I thought, fantastic, I mean, I'm a bit weird, but I thought it was fantastic that if you're on a train or in a pub or in a restaurant anywhere, Newcastle, Leeds, Belfast, Spalding, people were talking about politics. I mean, people got engaged. People were starting to take an interest. Now, I think that's great. I think whatever else you think about the referendum, the high degree of interest, of people bothering to find stuff out, of people actually getting up to vote. If you think about it, 2.8 million people who didn't see a point in voting in the general election of 2015 got up to vote in the referendum of 2016. Now, I think that's fantastic. You know, I wish everyone would vote. I think it's fantastic. And I think, you know, what else have we seen? In the general election, partly because of the referendum, there's a massive increase in young people voting. So for me, one of the things that makes a democracy healthy is not just the procedural stuff, though that's really important, but it's the participation of the people. And that is a positive we need to hang on to that's come out of this process.
from having the leprechauns in Northern Ireland and the Irish border, I think that might be an idea. Apart from that as a good solution, what is the likelihood of not actually leaving the EU? Article 50 is revocable by us, and I don't think it needs ratifying by the other 27, as far as I know. What are your views on us not leaving?
This is where Catherine and I start to squabble, because it's politics versus law. Catherine can talk about revocability. As far as I know, no one knows whether it's revocable or not until it goes to the European Court of Justice. If you look at our politics now, okay, not for the faint-hearted, one of the curious things about it is that any Brexit outcome is currently possible. From the possibility of us crashing out with nothing because of idiocy on both sides, because one of the things about politics is sometimes things happen that no one wants, all the way through to the possibility that we end up having a second referendum, all right? I am not going to be stupid, I'm not going to predict what's going to happen, but the way to a second referendum, it seems to me, would lie through public opinion changing. Because at the moment, public opinion is still around 50-50. There's been a slight wobble in the polls over the last month, nothing significant, and it would need to be far greater and far more sustained. Because what would happen then is that MPs, there's a lot of MPs at the moment who either don't want to leave the EU or want to stay in the single market, who are keeping their mouths shut because they don't want to be seen, in the famous words that were used, as enemies of the people. If the people have changed their mind, it frees them up to talk. So it is perfectly conceivable that by this time next year we have another referendum. But let me say two things about that for those of you who think that would be great. Just two words of caution, okay? The first word of caution is about what this would mean. Imagine we had a second referendum and we voted to remain in, okay, by, let's say, 52-48. The first thing that would happen is we would be a nightmare from hell for the European Union. Because no future government would find it easy to approve a European Union budget. It has to be approved by all member states, because everyone in this country thinks they know we give £350 million a week to the European Union. We don't, but everyone thinks they know it. So politically, that would be toxic. We would wreck the European Union if we were still divided, but we'd voted to stay in. Second thing is, think about what it would mean for our politics here if we just voted to stay in the European Union, all right? It would be like the political equivalent of Groundhog Day. We'd wake up and it would be 2011 again. And Nigel and Aaron Banks will be back here in force with their UKIP army saying, they've betrayed you. They gave you a vote, they didn't like the answer, they've betrayed you. They'd be polling in the 30%. The Tory party would be fracturing between the bunch who are quite pleased with the outcome and the Rees-Mogg lot who aren't. They'd be threatening to split. The Tory party would be running scared of its right fringe. People would be defecting to UKIP. We'd end up doing it again. So unless you get a significant and sustained shift in public opinion, staying in, I suspect, will be more dangerous than leaving.
I think the referendum is really flawed because people who can vote in EU politics and the local elections, EU elections, sorry, and local elections were directly affected by this referendum but couldn't vote. There's 3 million people who were disenfranchised who it directly affects, and I really think that the referendum was very unfair and would like a second referendum that actually included EU nationals to vote, and that would absolutely swing the vote.
Just explain who the 3 million
The 3 million are the EU nationals who live in the UK. Can I say a couple of things just back to you on that? Firstly, I would say there is a credible case to argue that the referendum was flawed, I suppose, because you don't think the right people voted. I don't think you can argue the referendum was fixed because we use the system we use for elections. They didn't bring in some brand new system. My problem with changing the franchise at any election is that what governments tend to do is they change it to make sure that the people who will vote for them can vote, which is what the Scottish government did before the Scottish referendum. Oh, we love 16 and 17-year-olds. No, you don't. You just know they're going to vote for independence. So the danger is, and I think one of the reasons why the Cameron government resisted calls to let the 3 million vote was because they thought they were going to win, and they thought the whole thing would be tainted by suspicions of it being rigged because you've changed the rules for this vote. So you need to tread very, very carefully around changing electoral rules, because the perception of the losers afterwards, if you change them more so than if you keep them,
is it was fixed. And do you want to talk about the law of Article thingy?
Article 50. Everyone's an expert.
Come on.
It's exciting. I never thought we'd get excited about Article 50. But there are a couple of questions under Article 50. One is, we notified, is that notification so-called revocable? So can we change our mind? Can we say, actually, call time on that notification, we'll withdraw it? Various points to make. First, we don't know, because Article 50 doesn't tell us. Secondly, in the so-called Miller case, that was a case brought by Gina Miller, challenging who could actually trigger Article 50, both sides, both Gina Miller and the government, said Article 50 is irrevocable. In other words, it's a one-way street. Once you've given notification, you can't change your mind. However, the House of Lords, in a Select Committee report before the referendum, said that Article 50 is revocable. Lord Kerr, who is one of the many people who claims to have drafted Article 50, says it's revocable. And there's quite a nice legal argument that if you look at the language of Article 50, it says it's an intention to withdraw. And indeed, the relevant Act of Parliament talks about an intention to withdraw. And up until the moment that you actually do withdraw, you can change your mind about that intention. So the balance of view is that, yes, Article 50 is revocable. More tricky is it a unilateral decision, i.e. does that mean that the UK can just say, we're going to do it? Or is it a bilateral decision? Does that mean that the EU's got to accept our change of heart? And then you start getting into the politics, because why might we want to revoke Article 50? If there's a big democratic moment, there's been a general election or a second referendum, then that would be a legitimate reason for revoking Article 50 notification. But if it's because we've got to the 25th of February, or end of February 2019, and negotiations are going so badly, and we think, right, this is a way to get ourselves out of a hole, it may be that people start saying, hang on a sec, this is a misuse of Article 50.
Okay, hang on a second. I'll get you in a second. You were very anxious to say something. Okay, go on then. And I'll get to you next. I haven't forgotten you.
May I say that?
Go on.
Say something? Sorry. Hi, because that referendum strongly affected me, because you're immigrants. I'm Polish. That's what you mentioned as an Eastern European. First, Poland is not Eastern Europe, it's a central of the Europe. But secondly, I feel very disappointed of the last referendum. And when you're saying about the gentleman, when you're saying about why British government didn't give me a right to vote about my future, because I have a kids in UK, which born in UK, and probably most of you decide about their future, and I didn't have the choice. And even I started a petition to give right to vote for your citizens. If you can sign that, that'd be great. You can find that in the Google. But also, I have another question to the panels. Even in the case of Brexit, or none of the Brexit, how you think, how longer UK still will be united? Because all the time you can hearing about some voices from Scotland about second independent referendums. Even in the Wales, people, they start to talking something about more independent from the Britain as well. Thank you.
I can say something on the politics of Scotland. We were at the SNP conference, and several interesting things about Scotland, I think. In a way, a lot of people are more scared of independence in Scotland now we're leaving the European Union, because they wanted Scotland to be independent and in, rather than independent outside the European Union. Because the European Union for small states is a kind of security blanket. It gives you the best of both worlds. It gives you control and independence, but it gives you that larger market. It gives you that sense of security. And actually, in the polls at the moment, there is not, in fact, support for independence has decreased. It's still balanced, but there's a slight trend downwards. And of course, the SNP, which isn't exactly the same as voting for independence, lost seats, about half its seats at the last general election. So at the moment, I don't think the SNP, and the SNP has rowed back on its demand for a referendum, I don't think we're going to see a Scottish referendum in the near future. I think actually, if you're talking about the future of the United Kingdom, the real issue is Ireland. And because what I was saying earlier about the debate about unifying Ireland, if we end up with a hard border between the north and south of Ireland, you will have a genuine debate in Ireland about unification. And I suspect you will have a referendum in Ireland before you have one in Scotland.
Thank you. My name is Anand, and I'm from a new politically neutral campaign called Our Brexit. And our aim is to get more young people engaged with the Brexit negotiations and the discussions. So I found it quite interesting how you said we're talking a lot more. And that's true, but nobody's talking to the young people. And from different polls that we've done in different discussions, they say that there's a lot of information such that they don't know where to start or what issues mainly affect young people. So that's what I wanted to ask you. So what issues do you think people aged between 16 to 25 should really either focus on or get more information about? Because you don't know, some of those people are the politicians of the next parliament and could really bring us back into the same cycle.
Let me say three things. Firstly, there's an organisation called My Life, My Say, and I spoke at an event they did last night in the House of Commons, and they released a report about what young people think about Brexit. They're an organisation for getting more young people involved in politics. So you might actually want to talk to them, but you should certainly look at their report. Second thing I'd say, there are all sorts of issues about about Brexit that young people should be thinking about, whether it's their right to travel and study. I mean, they're key ones. But, you know, the full panoply of issues about what your citizenship will be. I mean, we can talk after this. I don't want to sort of get into a deep debate about it, but the issues, there are an enormous number of issues about young people and the future of their lives and working careers that will be affected by this Brexit decision. The third thing I would say is this is just a uniquely fantastic moment for young people to get involved in politics, because what's happening at the moment is we had, as I said before, this enormous increase in turnout among young people at the last election, okay? And let me make one political prediction tonight. At the next general election, whenever that is, every party will have a section in its manifesto about young people, all right? Which none of them did last time. Why? Because they're thinking, oh, blimey, they vote. We've got to start taking it seriously. So for a young person, I mean, there are constraints, and one of the constraints is there aren't very many of you. So, you know, the British Election Survey, which looked at the referendum, came up with the number that, you know, a lot of people blamed young people for not voting for the Brexit result. 123% of under 25-year-olds would have had to vote to turn the result round. Now, even I, and I'm not very good at maths, understand that that's quite an ask. So you're outnumbered in the population, but at the moment you have a listening ear in Parliament, because people are, both big parties are now desperately scratching their heads saying, how do we appeal to young people? So what you're doing at the moment, I think you're going to be pushing at an open door.
Expanding on that, as someone who wasn't old enough to vote in the referendum, I'm curious as to what the main concerns are going to be long term, in like 30, 40, 50 years time onwards. What are the things that we're really going to be concerned about?
Right. Do you want a nightmare scenario?
Yeah.
Are you asking what's the nightmare scenario here?
What's
Go on.
case?
You want to?
Yeah.
You could do the economics.
Well, I mean, from an economic perspective, all the long-term projections are that the UK will be somewhat poorer than it would otherwise have been. Now, to be honest, it's not actually a nightmare economic scenario. We will be maybe 5% poorer than we otherwise would have been. So you'll be a little less rich, but that's not going to dramatically change anyone's quality of living. It's, you know, you would like to be 5% richer, but you can cope with it. From, you know, a personal perspective, what I would have thought would be, you know, very important looking forward into the future, and particularly for young people, is we stand to lose the ability to go and work and study in Europe, and that's going to restrict freedoms that we currently have. And I think it will change the way people in the United Kingdom think about their place in the world. Inevitably, we are going to be less outward looking if it's harder to move to Europe or to spend a bit of time to Europe. And also if we have fewer immigrants from Europe coming to the UK, it will change the way we view Britain's place in Europe and in the world. I think that is likely to be more important long term than the actual economic effects.
Nightmare scenario for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think what strikes me, obviously because I spend a lot of time with young people, my students and my own kids, is that their perspective on Brexit is very different from that of the older generation. And I'm struck when we go and do events like this in schools in Spalding and Boston, we say to them, how would you have voted? Because like you, they couldn't vote at the time, they were too young. And to our surprise, it's sort of 85%, 90% remain, even though their parents voted very strongly to leave. And I think what is the nightmare scenario is this cleavage between the older generation and the younger generation. and a sense of mistrust and suspicion on both sides, that the older generation often said that they voted to leave because they thought that would be good for their children, because it would open up opportunities for jobs and housing, whereas the younger generation saw the opportunities that may be denied to them going forward. And that's why I think we would all say it's really important that you get engaged in the way that this ladies' organisation is, to get your voices heard, because at the moment, for example, I was struck with something this morning, those who are advocating a very hard Brexit, there's a group of them who have written to the Prime Minister saying we fall back on WTO terms. The average age is 71. And so for young people, they have a different take, and it's your opportunity to have your say.
But how, you say that there might be this cleaving between the young and the old. How's that going to manifest itself? You know, rogues of youth going out and murdering their grandparents or anything.
Well, it manifests itself in politics now very clearly by, you know, you've all heard about the triple lock on pensions. That means that you guarantee the value of pensions. I mean, that's one way it manifests itself, is if you look at the figures on poverty in this country over the last couple of decades, what you'll see since the time that the Blair government started to worry about pensioners was that poverty amongst pensioners has decreased dramatically, but poverty amongst children has been going up. So you see it in all sorts of ways now. And of course, the calculation that politicians make, and you and I would make the same calculation if we were politicians. I mean, you pander to the people who vote, okay, whether you like it or not. That's just common sense. And older people are far more likely to go out and vote than young people. So one way to turn that around is to change that statistic. Another way to turn it around is to get involved in politics. One of the things that puts people off politics is that politics is old and white and male, right? So make it not old and white and male. You know, someone's going to have to be the first person who isn't to go in. I'm not the first person, but you know what I mean. Change what politics looks like, and it starts to appeal to more people. I mean, I'm going to do my nightmare scenarios. If we end up poorer, my kids will never bloody leave home, which is like, you know, the worst of all possible worlds.
Yeah. Sorry, you were going, Eleanor, go on.
In your opinion, when did the opinions of the UK people start to sour against the EU? When did it all start going wrong? Because I don't remember it, and I just wondered if it's always been there, or if something happened, or, yeah, just opinion question.
There are two bits to that answer, I think. Firstly, it's been there all along. And actually, one of the interesting things is overall, public opinion on the European Union didn't change very much at all through the referendum. It didn't change at all through the referendum. In fact, the referendum, in fact, had very little impact on public opinion. One of the best predictors of how the vote went was a survey taken in 2011. Ever since we joined the European Union, we've been amongst the bottom of the member states when it comes to how much you like EU membership. So we've always been... I mean, it's not surprising in a way, because we've been fed a diet of negative political commentary. In fact, you know, the fact that 40% ever thought it was good was remarkable, given what our politicians have always said about the EU. But it's always been there. What changed in the referendum, and what the Leave campaign did fantastically well, was they got their people out to vote. So what you find is in Leave areas, turnout is significantly higher than in Remain areas. The average, Scotland turned out below average. And that was a combination of using technology, using door knocking, using texting. The Leave campaign persuaded their voters, we were talking about this earlier, that this is the first time ever where your vote counts. You know, you live in a safe seat, your vote is pointless, because actually you know who's going to win. Why bother going? Every single person's vote counts in this election, and that message they got through very, very well. And so it was more a turnout thing than a changing of a mind thing.
But can you think of a moment when things seriously started to sour, the 80s, 90s? Well, I just wonder whether all the bent cucumbers, or, you know, the banning of imperial measurements, I wonder whether, you know, and trying to stop Cadbury's calling dairy milk chocolate and all that, I just wondered if that fed into some...
It was cumulative. It was cumulative. I mean, we voted to remain in the first referendum in 75. They did a poll 2 years later, and 60% of people said they'd vote to leave if they did it again. You know, it's been up and down a little bit. In the early 1990s, support for the European Union was pretty high in this country. Back, I mean, 1991 or 1992, the song that won the European Song Contest was a song in praise of the EU, which is like a remarkable thought now. But basically, amongst the other European states, we've always been pretty near the bottom of the class when it comes to our enthusiasm for the EU.
I think it is interesting, isn't it?
No, go ahead.
No, it is interesting, isn't it, that you mentioned the bent bananas and the cucumbers and stuff. What has never been covered in the press has been the good things that the EU's done. The coverage has been basically unremittingly negative. And here it's interesting, as academics we try and get some research into the press, trying to even get the BBC interested in anything to do with the EU prior to the referendum, which wasn't to do with bending bananas, absolutely impossible. And so there's been, the coverage has been negative. The good things about the EU, about, for example, the Erasmus scheme, which allows students to travel, well, students at universities know about it, but people who've not been to university don't see that as an advantage. That sort of good news story isn't sold. Now, of course, we know that it's much easier to sell a negative story than a positive one. And so then the Remain campaign comes along. It was a truly dire campaign, but it was also facing a total uphill struggle that it had in a matter of weeks to try and reverse decades of anti-Europe publicity and front pages.
Sorry, from what you both said, do you think if we'd had a referendum at any time in history in the last 20 years, do you think it would have been the same outcome?
Well, every time there's been some sort of referendum on the EU, the first time people have voted, they voted against. So at one level, it's very surprising that people were surprised at the outcome.
I think there were three things about the time we did it that shaped the outcome. I think the first was we'd spent 5 years watching the Eurozone crisis, and it was very, very easy, even though we weren't in the Eurozone, for the Leave campaign to say, that's what the EU does to countries. We saw the situation in Greece. The second was we'd spent a couple of years being subjected to the images of the refugees in the Mediterranean. And again, even though we're not part of Schengen, it was very, very easy for people to point at those pictures and say, that's what's coming if we stay in the European Union. The third thing is about us rather than about the European Union. I think the referendum happened at a moment when trust and participation in politics were very, very low. For a variety of reasons. They'd been sinking anyway during the course of this century, but you had the expenses scandal. You had the financial crisis. You had austerity. For a lot of those reasons, people no longer listened to or cared about politics. And then when you get a government that has implemented austerity, standing up in the person of George Osborne saying, look, if you vote to leave the European Union, our economy will change. Loads of people who'd been on the receiving end of those policies turn around and go, fantastic. When the head of the Remain campaign says, don't vote to leave the European Union or house prices will fall, for half the country, that was just that was an invitation, wasn't it? So I think there were contingent factors that made it worse than it might have been at another point in time. I'm still not convinced that it would have gone the other way at another time, but it would have been easier, I think, at other moments.
Tom?
Yeah, I guess kind of picking up on that, the thing that strikes me is that the referendum took place basically a decade after the start of the financial crisis. And median wages in the UK are lower today than they were 10 years ago. And that's the first time that's happened for over 100 years. And I think it's really interesting and actually really hard at this point to say with the data we have whether the vote was a vote against the EU or it was a broader protest vote about the fact that the last 10 years have been really difficult for the UK economically. So I think the fact that the global financial crisis happened could have played a role in how the referendum turned out.
You, sir, wanted to ask a question, and then I'll come to you.
I grew up during the Second World War, and when we had the referendum in the 1970s under Harold Wilson, I voted to go into the common market, and I emphasise the difference to the situation now. The other reason I voted to go into the common market was that hopefully it would be a force for peace. I've subsequently taken the view, particularly having regard to recent events, that the expansion of the European Union into what was the area controlled or influenced by Russia, i.e. beyond the Iron Curtain, has in fact increased the risk of conflict in Europe. What is your view?
So the EU overreaching itself with possibly dire consequences?
Let me say three things in response to you. I think, firstly, I've never really bought the idea that the EU caused peace. I think that's very simplistic. You've got things like NATO, you've got things like American troops, you've actually got things like the Soviet Union, which stopped the Europeans squabbling because it was a more pressing problem. I don't think it's true that expansion to Eastern Europe has led to more instability. I think one of the triumphs of the EU has been, if you think about what happened in Central and Eastern Europe after 1989, those countries transformed themselves into liberal market economies and democracies, despite the fact that there were all sorts of border squabbles and diaspora issues there, without a shot being fired. It was peaceful. And actually in 1989, you would not have predicted that. And it was partly the impact, the influence, the magnetic power of the European Union that led to that. And actually, in that sense, I think the European Union has extended stability through enlargement, as it did into the southern countries of Spain and Portugal. Now, on the actual issue of war and peace during the referendum itself, it's very interesting because the Remain camp, David Cameron had his pollsters do some focus groups on whether the security argument worked. And they found over and over again that the voters just didn't believe it. The voters said, they're not going to stop cooperating with us on terrorism if we vote to leave. That would just be stupid. So actually what you found was in the actual referendum campaign itself, it wasn't talked about very much because the Remain camp decided it wouldn't work for them. I don't know whether that's true or not, and whether if they'd said more about it, it would have worked. But it wasn't an issue, a very serious issue in the referendum campaign at all.
Gentleman over here.
Just moving the debate, if you like, from the really big issues that you've been talking about to a more parochial one. You know, the West Midlands traditionally has been the home of the car manufacturing sector. I live about a mile from the Land Rover plant. You know, with just-in-time manufacturing and with engines being produced in various parts of Europe and then being assembled in other parts of Europe, a 10% tariff, how are we going to overcome that?
In practice, it would be very difficult because, I mean, not only is it a 10% tariff, right, but with these just-in-time supply chains, components often cross borders many times before the car is finished. So the tariff kind of accumulates. It's 10%, then it's 20, and it's 30, and you keep adding it up. And it would make the British car industry much less competitive if we were to leave the customs union. And I expect what you would see over the longer term is when these it came round to the new rounds of investment in the car factories, we would find that repeatedly sites in Europe won out in the bidding process over sites in the UK. The solution to that is either you stay in the customs union. Staying in the customs union solves most of the problems for the car industries because it's that tariff issue they're really worried about. Or you need some kind of free trade agreement with the EU which removes the tariffs for the car industry. Now, over the medium term, that's gettable. The question is, how do you kind of transition to that process? And you know, if there's a period of high tariffs and then low tariffs in the long run, that's kind of useless. You need to keep tariffs low all the way through, and we don't yet know whether that's going to happen.
Can I just add two things to that? Tariffs are crucial, but especially JLR, which is a sort of high-end manufacturer, one of the things that JLR spend a lot of time thinking about is regulations. And what's happening at the moment is that cars are changing dramatically. Cars are becoming computers. They're becoming smart cars. And the new generation of regulations for smart cars are currently being drafted, and they're being drafted in Brussels. All right? And one of the things that people at JLR are slightly nervous about is the fact that if we're no longer a member state, then it's going to be Peugeot and Citroën who are sat around that table via their respective governments, and we won't be there. And that is going to have a negative impact on us. And actually, I live in Oxford, so I follow the BMW plant there quite closely. And one of the interesting things there was BMW have recently said they're going to manufacture the electric Mini in Oxford. But if you look into the fine print of that announcement, it's quite interesting because what they've said is they're going to make the engine and the battery in Germany and they're going to send them to Oxford where they're going to be put together. There is no real new investment. And for me, that was evidence of BMW hedging because I would have expected them to build the whole thing there. It would have been easier for them in all sorts of ways. But this I took to be, look, we're not going to do anything dramatic like pull out, but let's just hold our horses about sticking new stuff there for the moment and see where it pans out. So I think there is a sort of collective holding of breath in the car industry.
Two more quick questions from the back. That gentleman there first.
Hi. I note that there's a degree of optimism about the extent of political participation as a result of the Brexit issue, and also a decrease in voter apathy as well. My concern is that isn't this a little too optimistic, and then after we leave the EU, if indeed we leave the EU, that politics will become complicated again, because the reason why you had more political participation was because the issue was presented in very simplistic terms, but also because the EU has been painted as a big bogeyman, and one only has to look at the long list of false stories that you can find on the EC delegation in the UK's website. Isn't there a risk that in future politics will become complicated again, leading to voter apathy once again? And can I ask, what's going to be the future bogeyman if it's no longer the EU?
Would you like to answer that one first?
Go on, that's the next question. But
That's the first time in my life I've been accused of being optimistic, so thank you for that. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. My sense is that people who've participated and found that actually their vote counted for something will keep participating.
We'll get a taste for it.
Yeah. And actually what political science tells us is what you do in your first election shapes your electoral behaviour. People who don't vote in their first election do not vote. So the fact that young people are voting in greater numbers bodes well for the future. Now, yes, politics is complicated. I don't think, the referendum, there were a lot of simplistic slogans bandied around. Are you saying there aren't in our general elections? Of course there are. There are, this was the election when the Tories didn't cost their manifesto. They just threw out some promises and said, yeah, it'll be fine. I mean, that's what happens in electoral politics. But I'm not saying we will maintain the same levels of participation. I'm saying I hope we do. On bogeymen, actually, that's one of the good things about this for me, is I don't want my politicians blaming someone or something else for what's happening. I want them to take responsibility and to figure out ways of fixing it. So actually, if we don't have a bogeyman, and, don't get too hopeful. The EU is going to be a bogeyman for the next decade or two, because they'll find ways to say, well, that's what they did to us in the past. Eventually, though, they're going to have to take responsibility, and I think that's good.
Just a very quick one from you.
Yes. So I work for Jaguar Land Rover, and I work in the supply chain. I work in the prototype that you noted, and it's more than 10%, in which if we were to fall back on the WTO rules, it could be up to 40% for some parts. If that were to happen, that would be absolutely detrimental for Jaguar Land Rover. That is the reason why our CEO, Ralph Speth, is with Theresa May, trying to express the seriousness of the situation and the dynamics with the trade. My question is, taking that into consideration, do the taxpayers in the United Kingdom understand the hidden costs already that have been charged upon them for Brexit? So for instance, would be the Nissan deal. No one knows, really, not even Jaguar Land Rover knows the hidden deal between Nissan and the British government. Now, these are basically blank checks that we're writing to try to keep business here.
You're right, there's a big kerfuffle, but we're still none the wiser on that. It all got forgotten.
Yeah.
You must know. What's the number? Come on. What are they giving us?
We'd all like to know what was in that deal. It was really interesting looking at the kind of polling in the run-up to referendum, whether people, because there was this broad consensus among economists that, whatever else you thought of Brexit, there was going to be an economic hit. But that didn't show up in the polling when you asked people, do you think Brexit will be bad for the UK? And I'm not sure that message has really got through yet. I think there is still a lot of kind of suspension of disbelief about what we're in store for in the future. Both in terms of what's going to happen to wages, but also what this is, as wages goes down and as the economy shrinks, it's going to be bad for the government's tax revenue, and that's going to affect everyone, because it's going to mean less money to spend on things like the NHS and schools and services that everyone uses. And I don't think people yet have kind of fully internalized what level of shock we face there.
Can I ask you one final question? Plainly, we're all aware how complicated the issues are. Of the present cabinet and shadow cabinet, how many have got a decent grasp of all this? Well, it's a serious question. Do you name names? Philip Hammond. Philip Hammond, you'd say he's got an idea. Well, he's toast, everyone says, so that doesn't help us, does it? What do you think?
I think in terms of ministries, I think the Department for Leaving the EU has got a lot of information and a lot of research is done over the last few years. I think the Treasury is exactly the same. I think both David Davis and Philip Hammond know the details.
So
I think other members of the cabinet. You've got to distinguish between bluster and knowledge. I think there are people playing a double game with us in politics at the moment. But I think actually one of the worst culprits for me in what's happening at the moment is Jeremy Corbyn. Because Jeremy Corbyn keeps repeating we want tariff-free access to the single market. It is the world's single most meaningless phrase. And yet he repeats it as his policy. So on both sides of the aisle, you're basically being messed about because what the Tories want is to be left in peace to do what they're doing. What Labour want is to not commit themselves to anything so that whatever happens, they can blame the Tories and say we'd have done it differently, even though they won't commit to what they would have done. And that's just how the political game's going. It's not in anyone's interest to be specific or detailed with us, sadly.
Has anyone got 10% of your grasp of trade economics?
I mean, as you said, I think Philip Hammond and the team at the Treasury have a pretty good handle of what's going on. I actually think the Department of International Trade understands the issues they need to face in negotiating trade deals with other countries. They just can't do it for the next few years. So they're kind of sitting around. They've done all this research into what we would have to do, but until we actually leave the customs union, they can't do anything. So now they're just sort of sitting on their hands, waiting, unfortunately.
Okay, well, thanks to all of you. Let's hear it for the panel and for yourselves as well, being a great audience. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Thanks.